then like I mentioned last week, we can't start with the existence of something. I can't even assume that this marker is real, because it might fall under number one. Where do we start? What did we talk about last week?
That's not a marker.
No. We start with, anyone remember? Self-consciousness. Self-consciousness. Self-consciousness is the only piece of reality that we ourselves cannot escape, because it's not outside of ourselves, it's within ourselves. So before we get to, does this marker exist? Is it a blue marker? We have to go back, way back to, do I exist? Who am I? What am I thinking right now? Why am I thinking it? We're looking for proof that God exists. A rational person has to be compelled to surrender to that proof. We talked about this in the introduction 2 weeks ago, or a few weeks ago. The difference between proof and persuasion. Proof is objective. Here's evidence, whether it's tangible or logical or rational. But persuasion is subjective, and that's the work of the Holy Spirit. I can prove that all men are mortal, and that I am a man, therefore I must be mortal. Remember what that's called, the analytical statement, where there's no way you could disprove that statement to me, because by very nature, that statement has to be true. Okay? It's indisputable, yet there might be people who are convinced that we are immortal. Right? God must be the one who persuades and changes the disposition of our hearts. Because if we can prove that God exists, then that means I'm going to be held accountable for how I live. And Pastor Edmund touched upon this today. People want to be free from guilt, accountability. So we're not talking about a neutral playing field. They have a compelling reason not to believe in God, even if the proof is overwhelming. Okay, so let's start with number one. So some of you guys might think this is a big waste of time, right? When I was starting researching this, I'm like, who really believes that everything is an illusion? Well, Greek philosophers, 400 BC, George Berkeley, his namesake is UC Berkeley, from the 18th century, British philosopher, believes that reality is an illusion. And 21st century philosopher Elon Musk. Do you guys know that? He believes that our existence is an illusion created by AI. So this is not something that nobody believes in. There are some influential people in society that their whole realm of thinking revolves around this concept. So to argue against this, I'm going to call Rene Descartes. Yes, Descartes. That's how you spell it. 16th century French philosopher, mathematician, scientist, brilliant man. And this was the time during the Reformation where the reformers were going against the authority of the Catholic Church. This was the time when science and religion were butting heads, because here comes Galileo saying, hey, church, I think you guys are wrong when it comes to Earth being the center of the universe. I can prove it. You want to look through my telescope? No, you're heretical. The Bible doesn't say that. Be gone. This was the time where authority was being questioned. Truth itself was being questioned. Can I even know anything? Right? I just learned that the Catholic Church and everything that they taught was not right. I just learned that everything I knew about the earth and the sun was not right. How do I know anything? And this is the dilemma that he was in. He was trying to establish some foundation of certainty when it comes to how do I know that something is clear and distinct and true, that's indisputable, cannot be rejected, and is unable to be disproved, because he wanted certainty to come back into science, certainty to come back to authority, certainty to come back into the church. And so he started with uncertainty. He took this approach. I'm going to be skeptical about everything. I'm going to believe that nothing is true. If there's something to doubt, I'm going to doubt it. If there's something to disprove, I'm going to try to disprove it. And he's going to ask the question, how do you really know that it's true? Because if I don't ask those questions and I just assume that certain things are real, maybe this whole world is run by the great deceiver, whether it's Satan or some other god that is just fooling us into thinking that anything here exists or anything is real. So he thought about this a lot. He finally came up with a solution. How many of you don't know this Latin phrase? Cogito, ergo sum. English? I think, therefore I am. This is where that phrase comes from. How many of you have heard of that? I think, therefore I am. So, what does this mean? He says this: no matter how skeptical I become about anything, or how much I doubt about anything in this world, the one thing I know for sure is that I'm doubting. I can't doubt that I'm doubting. That much I know for sure. Now, what is required for there to be doubt? If I know with certainty that I'm doubting, then what needs to be? Doubt requires thought, conscious thought. And conscious thought, because doubt is an act of thinking. You have to think in order to doubt. So there needs to be thinking. Doubt requires a doubter, since thought requires a thinker. You cannot have thought without a thinker. So his logic is this: doubt leads to thinking, leads to being. I think, therefore I am. I must be real, because if I backtrack, I'm doubting. And I know I'm doubting. I can't dispute that. But if I'm doubting, there has to be a thought. And if there's a thought, there needs to be a thinker. And if there's a thinker, there needs to be a being. So I am real. Just because I can touch myself or look at myself doesn't mean I'm real. I'm real because I just proved it through this reason and logic. So he wanted to get certainty of reality, almost like a math equation. You guys see that? That you have to go from here to here. And if you're going to assume this, then you have to assume some form of being, a thinker. And not necessarily to be dependent on our senses so much. And again, this begins with the knowledge of our self-consciousness. This is where all reality has to start, if you're going to argue about anything. Because our mind is the only mind we have. We can't start with the mind of God. I can't start with your mind. I can only start with what's in here. Because if I lose all my limbs and all of my sense perception, I still have my thoughts, and therefore I am. You can cut off all my limbs, and I'm still not less of a person than you, because I have my mind. This gives me my being. So the conclusion is, if there's illusions in reality, then maybe all of reality is an illusion. If all of reality is an illusion, then nothing exists, including myself. And we know that not to be the case because of this logical formula that he came up with. So I can't even doubt my own existence without proving the reality of my own existence. Do you guys see that logic? If I'm doubting, that immediately proves that I exist. Because of this. Doubting, thinking, being. Now, some oppose this view that says, we still need to make assumptions if this is going to be true. And what are those assumptions? The 4 laws of knowledge that we talked about last week. You have to assume that we live in a world that is rational, logical, and is non-contradictory. You have to assume that we live in a world that functions off of cause and effect. That every effect has a cause. You have to assume that our sense perception is reasonable. And you have to assume the analogical use of language. But none of those 4 can we compromise as Christians. So, talked about number 1. Let's talk about self-creation. Again, this is one of the most frequent alternatives to theism that most atheists take. Now, even the proponents of number 2, they might not ever say that the universe itself was self-created, but their ideas actually surround this concept and they can't escape it. But if you actually ask yourself this question, something is self-created. Like we talked about, if a statement is analytically true, like a bachelor is an unmarried man, that it's analytically true, you can't falsify that statement. How can you commonsensically make this statement true? How can something be self-created? If it didn't exist before itself, how can it create itself? It's an analytically false statement, but you have bright, brilliant minds that put all their reality hopes on this concept of self-creation. It's an analytically false statement. If you want to create something that is, you must have been. And if you must have been, then you must have been. You follow this illogical conclusion? There is no such thing as self-creation. It's an absurd concept. Now, people might argue, well, so is self-existence. No, there's a difference. Self-creation violates the first law of rationality, logic, and non-contradiction. The concept of self-existence does not. It does not violate any one of those laws of knowledge. If we say something is eternal, that it has the power of being in and of itself, you don't have to believe it, but it doesn't violate any of the four laws that we talked about last week. It's not irrational in and of itself, that concept. But this one, self-creation, it's absurd by definition. It's illogical. Not even God can create himself. How many of you guys have heard that? Maybe it's not a story, but if you ask your kid, oh, who made the chair? Oh, the company. Who made your food? Oh, mama did. Who made mama? Oh, God did. Who made God? God made God. Wrong. God did not make God. There's no being in the universe that could self-create because it's analytically false by definition. Now here's some theories under self-creation that you guys might be more familiar with. Spontaneous generation. Any science teachers in here? No? Good. So this theory came, okay? From the Enlightenment period, 19th century. So this is when modern science was up and coming, all these new discoveries were happening, Darwinism, all these things. And God was no longer necessary to explain the origins of the universe. So here they came up with this concept of spontaneous generation. We know that material things came into being through spontaneous generations. Now, where did this concept come from? So if you walked by a mud puddle after it rained, after you notice about 2 or 3 days, you'd notice little tadpoles in there. From nothing comes something, was the theory that they proposed. Not knowing that before modern science invented the microscope, that maybe there were some bacteria that were flying around in the air. Maybe a bird carried some kind of, something, dropped it in the puddle, and it created life as they saw it. This was a big deal in the late 1800s, and that wasn't the only experiment. Maggots forming on raw meat. How many of you, by just observance, can see the cause of those maggots if you leave something out? You don't. You wake up the next morning and you're like, oh, there's a bunch of maggots on that raw meat. Where did it come from? Now assume that you didn't know anything about microscopes, you didn't know anything about bacteria. Self-creation. It just happened. Okay? So in 1864, this scientist named Louis Pasteur, very, very interesting, this guy. He had some doubts about things being created from nothing. So he did an experiment. He got 2 bottles, glass bottles with broth inside, and he boiled both of them to make sure everything living in there was killed off. And then one of those bottles, he put an S-shaped spout on it. So the end of the spout went like this. The other bottle, he left open to the elements. After 1 year, this bottle that was open to the elements was teeming with life. All kinds of microscopic stuff and things swimming in there. This S-shaped bottle, 0 signs of life. So he concluded, and this was the definitive experiment that should have blasted this theory out of existence. But there's still people to this day who believe it. Where basically, if you eliminate the concept of airborne particles, it's here, proof that because I curved it, by definition, no particles are going to go up, it's going to come down because of gravity. Once I annihilate that part of it, there's no life. Nothing comes from nothing. Something cannot self-create itself. Now, the fact that there's living things here is because of airborne particles. There was multiple experiments done before this guy, but he proved it definitively. After the 1 year, he cut the top of that bottle. 3 days later, life. So people were just like blown away by this experiment. But people who believe this, they're actually ignoring a fundamental law of science. Can I erase this? Another Latin phrase. Okay. Anyone know what this means? Right? Out of nothing, nothing comes. Out of nothing, nothing comes. Nothing can't produce something. But people still believe this. And I'm not just talking about any person on the street. People like Stephen Hawking believed this till the day he died. Nobel Prize winning scientist at Stanford. This was maybe a decade or two ago. He came out and said, you know what? We can no longer affirm spontaneous generation. I'll give you that. But we need to replace it with gradual spontaneous generation. You can't get something out of nothing quickly, but it takes time. Maybe eons and eons and eons. But eventually, you can get something out of nothing. It's absurdity. It's absurdity. But there's people that stake their whole lives on this concept that something can come from nothing. You know, in 1990, the Hubble telescope was sent out into orbit. And there's a famous astrophysicist that explained the beginnings of the universe. He said, you know, now that we have this telescope and we see the expansiveness of the universe, 15 to 18 billion years ago, when the universe exploded into being, is the exact language that he uses. He didn't necessarily say that exploded into its current form, with the 9 planets and the sun and the Milky Way galaxy. It exploded into being and eventually found itself as our solar system. But what was it before? What exploded into being? And how did that thing come into existence? Is a question that no scientist on Earth can answer. To this day, and they never will. This is philosophical nonsense. It's irrational thinking. Now, associated with the spontaneous generation is this theory called chance creation. Chance creation. By far the most popular theory by atheists. Okay. I'm not an expert in science. I don't think any of you guys are here either. I'm not even questioning the methods, okay? But you don't have to be an expert in physics to analyze statements made by certain people when they articulate certain theories about something. Let me tell you. So someone once said, as long as chance rules, God becomes an irrelevance. As long as chance rules, God becomes an irrelevance. I would actually correct that person to say, if chance exists, God is irrelevant. Chance doesn't even need to rule. It just needs to exist. Just the possibility of something called chance creating something means God is irrelevant. He needs to be dethroned. He's no longer reigning. And my premise is this. There is no such thing as chance. There is no such thing as chance. This is the greatest myth in modern history that half the world has bought into. Let me explain with an example. There's a Harvard professor that was having dinner with R.C. Sproul, and he told R.C., I believe the universe came into being by chance. And this is the experiment that R.C. Sproul used. He said, you really believe the universe came into being by chance? He said, yes, I do. I said, okay. Took out a quarter. He said, what's the chance that this comes heads? 50-50. Okay. How much influence did chance have on the result of this flip? What does chance have anything to do with how this quarter ends up? It has something to do with how I'm holding it. It has something to do with how low I start from. It has something to do with how many rotations the quarter goes. It also has something to do with whether I touch it and flip it, or just touch it and show you. There's factors involved in determining whether or not that quarter is going to end up heads or tails. If I threw that quarter 1,000 times in a preset vacuum where all other factors were held constant, what's the chance that it'll turn heads? 100%. Do you guys see that? After he said this, the Harvard professor, he literally smacked his head from what RC said. He said, I guess I shouldn't have said the universe was created by chance. And he says, you're right, you should not have said that. Now, it's a perfectly good word, right? We use it all the time when describing, mathematical possibilities, or the odds of something happening, or maybe a chance encounter, like a serendipitous event, like, oh my gosh, what are the chances that I see you here out of all the people? Well, it's because my schedule made me meet the other person here, and you had a separate schedule. That there's reasons behind it, some of which we don't understand, some of which we'll never fully comprehend, but there's no such thing as chance, that this external force that brought you and you together serendipitously. You could say it's by accident, right? It wasn't purposeful, our meeting, but don't say it's by chance, because chance is just a mathematical possibility. Now, in modern times, we've used that word to attribute all kinds of causal power to this word chance. We think that when we shuffle cards, when we go to a dealer in Vegas, that it's by chance that an ace comes out first. Well, how about the fact that it has to do with your starting point of the deck, how many times you've shuffled it, if you shuffled it one last time, if you cut the deck afterwards, all of that is attributable to the result, none of which we can see, but don't attribute it to something called chance. This marker is a thing, right? It has an existence, it has a being. I am a person, I have an existence, I have a being. This word chance is not a thing. It's no thing. Chance is nothing. Nothing. Again, it's a good word that we can describe to explain certain events. But it's nothing. It has no power. It has no being. It has no causal authority whatsoever. And that's why you guys understand now, if there was such a thing as chance to cause anything to happen, God would be dethroned. This would trump God. This thing called chance. I just explained this to you in 5 minutes. But people still believe that the world came into existence by chance. Now, again, Julia sent me a really funny YouTube video about how to sound smart, like ways to sound smart. And there was this guy on the screen, he was like talking all this gibberish, and he was talking slowly, and he was pointing his finger like this, and he was kind of doing this, and everyone's watching, he's like, oh, and the guy walks by and he's like, you guys are idiots. He's not saying anything meaningful. And it was really, really funny video, but it just proves that there can be brilliant people that are proponents of this theory, but it's a nonsensical, illogical theory. The way, again, I'm not a scientist, but the way subatomic particles behave in certain environments are still confusing to scientists. They seem to behave randomly. Now, it's one thing if a scientist says, I don't know why it's behaving this way. I can't explain it. Even when I hold everything else constant, it shouldn't be that way. So I don't know what's going on. That's one thing. But it's another thing to say, nothing is producing this effect. They're just moving just because of chance. There's nothing that's causing this. I factored in every single thing I know as the most brilliant scientist that I am. But because I can't explain it, I'm going to put it up to chance. Now, if you can honestly say that, you would have to be an omnipotent being. Because you would have to know every single invisible subatomic action and process and attribute to that experiment to safely say that nothing is causing those cells to move in that way. But we're not omnipotent. We don't know everything that's going into that experiment, even if we're the ones conducting it. We don't know all the invisible elements that this universe is made up of. So say that you don't know it. Be honest about it. Be intellectually honest, but don't say nothing is creating that. So under closer scrutiny, number 2, self-creation, it's an absurd notion. Number 3, self-existence. Okay, now we ask this question again. Is it possible or even rational to believe that something is self-existent? Right? We just proved that it's logically impossible for something to create itself. But is it logically impossible to believe that something can self-exist for all eternity? I would argue there's nothing irrational about a self-existent being that is not caused by something else. And this goes back to our first cause theory. It doesn't violate the law of cause and effect. Because what does the law of cause and effect say? Every effect must have a cause. Not everything. There's one thing in the universe that doesn't have a cause. And that is a self-existent eternal being. But just because we can say, well, it doesn't violate any of the 4 laws of knowledge and therefore we must believe, of course not. Like I said, it's feasibly possible that there exists a unicorn. But doesn't mean exists. Okay? So we have to prove that it exists. Not just say, well, it doesn't violate reason and logic. Okay. So this is where that phrase, if something exists, there must be a self-existent being, comes into play. We can't just believe it. We have to prove that it's rationally necessary. There has to be a self-existent eternal being if there is anything at all in reality. And we just proved that number 1 and 2 are false statements. So we turn to Aquinas, Thomas Aquinas, one of the most brilliant minds in all of Christian theology. And he says this. He has an attribute called aseity. This is just a fancy word for the concept of being. Concept of being.
Can you spell Thomas's last name?
Yes. Aquinas. Much of what I'm arguing here has been argued by Thomas Aquinas, St. Augustine. Those two. So this concept of having the power of being in and of itself, that nothing had to create it or nothing had to cause it, that it's inherent, it's eternal. Never has there been a time where this being has not existed, is his concept, okay? Now he says that God is this being, is a necessary being because of 2 reasons. First reason is it's rationally necessary. By virtue of rationale and logic, the existence of God is rationally necessary. If something exists, then something has always existed. If there was even a time that there was nothing, now think about this statement. If there was ever a time where there was nothing, what can there be possibly now? If there was ever a time where there was nothing, what can there be possibly now? Yes?
I have a question. The reason that the reason 2 and 3 is because 2 is false because we don't know the time?
No, 2 is false by definition. If someone self-creates themselves, that means they have to exist before. If they existed before, then someone else had to create. It's an illogical.
Because you don't know when the beginning is.
Correct. So that's why it's inevitable to go from 2 to 3. 3 is a little bit closer to the truth. That something has to be self-existent. It can't be self-created. But now we're at this point of self-existence. And the ex nihilo nihilo fit. Out of nothing, nothing comes. Is that concept that we're holding on to. Okay. Now, some people argue, I don't know if you've heard this, but I actually heard this maybe about 8 years ago from one of my old coworkers, brilliant guy, right? Harvard graduated, top law firm, partner law firm, served as general counsel. Anyways, we're talking about religion, and he said, did you know that quantum mechanics has now proven that something can come out of nothing? And that rocked me, because I was 28 years old. I was like, what? That goes against everything I know about Scripture and God. But I looked a little closer into it, and it says, even quantum mechanics itself says that there's really no such thing as empty space. No such thing as empty space. That even in the most perfect vacuum, where you conduct all your experiments, there's still a minuscule amount of rolling clouds of particles and antiparticles. And I'm talking as if I know what I'm talking about, but I don't. But just follow the concept with me. There's no such thing as a completely empty anything, whether in space or in reality here. Science continues to show that there are mysteries. Maybe things we don't understand, but it's still absurd to say that something can come from nothing. It's not good science. Now, of course, this doesn't prove that the something has to be God or even a personal being, but just that reason demands the existence of a self-existent eternal something. That's all we're at right now. Now, this is extremely important because most of the criticism that flies in the face of Christianity has a lot to do with creation. Where we came from, how this world came into existence, who created the universe, what created the universe, did the universe create itself? So we have to get this point, at least at this point, that there needs to be a self-existent eternal something. Okay. The second reason why there needs to be a necessary being, and I brought this phrase up last week, but it's ontologically necessary. Now this is one of those, again, fancy words for being, again. Ontology is just the study of being, the nature of being. Now this says this, he exists by his own nature, not by what reason says. Because by his nature, he cannot not be. He cannot not be. And this is the difference between humans and God. It's a difference of being. I didn't exist 100 years ago. I'm not going to exist 100 years from now. I have a very short, finite time in which I exist. By definition, a being of a deity has to always be. There's no start and finish with this being. So it's ontologically necessary. I know sometimes it's confusing to get these two mixed up, but he's changeless. He cannot not have the power of being. He's not in some state of becoming or state of declining. He just is. From beginning, actually there is no beginning, from eternity past to eternity future, and all the way in between. Okay, now, I shouldn't have started off with this. A necessary, eternal something is where we start. Now that we've kind of established that there needs to be a self-existent something, now how do we get from that to there being a being, a personal being? Why can't it just be some computer like AI? Why does it have to be a being? Now, theories of the universe's origins changed all throughout the centuries. You guys know that. And even in the last 60 years, you know, the Big Bang didn't even come around until, it wasn't taken seriously until about 60 years ago. And since the beginnings of it, there's been all kinds of variations, but let me give you two in a nutshell. This is the basic premise of the Big Bang theory. That 15 to 18 billion years ago, before anything was, there was a single point of what they call singularity. Single point. And this point represented a compaction of all matter, all energy that is currently found in the universe. Everything you know exists in the universe, if you break it down to its subatomic particles, existed in this one single point. And this point existed for all eternity in an organized and stable way. But for reasons unknown, this point exploded, and out of it came together certain gases, elements, materials, which formed everything as we know it today. That's the Big Bang theory. Another way to say it is, this universe went from organization to disorganization, because it went from the single point, compaction of all we know is reality, and something caused it to explode into chaos and eventually form itself to an organized solar system that we know today. From steady state to explosion. And if you believe that, if you believe the Big Bang, that means you have to believe the universe is actually wearing down, and this is what scientists believe, and eventually it's going to become a black hole. Now, if this is true, a reasonable person has to ask a few questions. How did this single point of singularity come to a place of organization to begin with? If it's moving from organization to disorganization, then organization was the original state of things, was it not? Another question is, you guys know the law of inertia?
Yeah.
What's the law of inertia say?
An object in motion will stay in motion.
Correct.
An object in motion will stay in motion. Unless
Things in motion tend to remain in motion unless acted upon by an outside force. So the fact that when you play golf, you're in this law of inertia. Because if there was no law of inertia, you hit the golf ball and go on forever and ever and ever and ever, and nothing would ever stop it. But we know there's something called gravity that stops the ball from moving forever. And the same thing is the opposite. If things are at rest, they tend to remain at rest unless enacted by an outside force. That's the law of inertia. Every scientist believes this. But this falls flat in the face of it, doesn't it? Something, a single point of singularity, for reasons unknown, exploded from organization to disorganization. Now, of course, the big question is what caused the bang? What caused the bang? No one can answer that question. Scientists will avoid that question with all they've got because they have no explanation. And that's where this whole chance thing comes in. It's by chance. Now, this is a cop-out. If you ask me, it's a cop-out. If you say you don't know, but don't attribute it to something that is a not thing like chance. But we believe God is not only the power of motion, He's the ability to move things that doesn't have the power of moving in and of itself. Even Aristotle knew this. Aristotle wasn't a believer, right? One of the foremost philosophers of our day knew that there needed to be an origin of motion. He knew this law of inertia ever before it was defined. There has to be a being that had the power of motion within himself. An unmoved mover, as he called it. Unmoved mover. Of course, this doesn't answer the question either of, have any of you guys asked in your mind, well, where did the single point come from, Steve? Did it exist truly for all eternity? Is that what we really believe? That's what scientists believe. It existed for all eternity. Now, if we're honest with ourselves, we know that there's nothing in this material world called eternity. But everything is mutable or changeable. Everything changes. It gets better. It gets worse. It goes from here to there. One state to another. Even materialists know this. Now, materialists believe that matter is the fundamental substance of nature. That all of reality is made up of material things. Now, it doesn't have to be this kind of material. It could be cells and, subatomic particles. But that's what they believe. But even materialists would say this, that even though this marker is not eternal or self-existent, it's made up of elements that are self-existent and eternal. But it's not transcendent. It's not some being that's above this world and greater than this world. It's part of the things that are in this world. Sounds a lot like universalism. But that's the logical conclusion that any materialist or scientist that believes in self-existent, eternal something has to come to. That it's not God, it's not a personal being, it's whatever matter makes up all of us, including this and this and this and this and this and this. That has to be eternal. Matter within each item. So materialists, they believe in self-existence, they believe in eternality. They don't believe in self-creation, but they believe that this self-existent something is not God. It's just part of the universe. Now, why do we Christians say that this something or someone has to be outside the universe? Why do we say that? Well, it depends on how you define the universe. Right? If you mean that the universe is all that is, including God, then yes, I guess you have to assume that whatever eternal particles are in here also belong to God. But if we believe that when we say the word universe, it's everything in this created order that we see, then we can't believe that, because, now put on your thinking caps. We say in theology that God transcends the universe. That does not mean we're talking about being. We're not talking about location. It doesn't mean that God is physically above the universe and he's looking down. It means he's a different order of being. He's a greater being than anything else that exists in reality, in all of life. Than the sun, than the marker, than pure energy, than anything.
Like he's outside the dimension, like he's not in a physical place, is what you're saying, right? No dimension.
He's a greater form of being. So it doesn't mean, when we say we pray to heaven, we do this, right?
That's
It
figurative.
doesn't necessarily mean heaven in the sky. Now that's figurative language that the Bible uses, but heaven is some other place that we can't even imagine. We don't know what heaven is, right? And the same thing, that God is not always above us. He's here, and he's here, and he's here. He's within the church. He's orchestrating life's events. But he's a different level of being. He transcends. That's what that word transcends means. It's not a word for location. Okay. So, if you're saying that within the universe, within this marker, something is self-existent and eternal from which everything else is created. Okay, if you say that, then what you're saying is, in this marker, whatever is in this marker transcends whatever is out of the marker. You guys follow that? Whatever is in here, that matter, transcends the marker itself. Because you have to. You cannot not distinguish between that eternal single point of singularity and the marker itself. You have to distinguish the two, because one generated the other. And so in essence, what they are saying is that thing does transcend the universe itself, because it made it. So the essence that we all have in each one of us, in this marker, has to be a different order of being than the marker itself, than this sheet of paper. Now, if we get to that point, now it's just a matter of what you call it. Scientists call it a point of singularity. I can call it Steve. You can call it X. Israel calls it Yahweh. But now we've gotten to nothing exists, to something exists, to now a self-existent something exists, and now it's a matter of what is that thing, and does it have to be a personal being? So we have an unmoved mover, higher order of being. The next question has to be, how do we know it's the God of the Bible? As opposed to the God of philosophy. Two different kinds of gods. Roman gods, Greek gods, Hindu gods, whatever gods are out there versus God of Scripture. Okay? But we've come a long way, right? From nothing to self-existent eternal being. Not only the God of the Bible, but before we get there, how do we know it's a personal God? Why can't it be a God that just created the universe, he's self-existent eternal, and he's like, see ya. There's a church historian named Tertullian, and he was trying to show the radical difference between the God of the Bible and the God of the philosophers. And he has this famous quote. He says, what does Jerusalem have to do with Athens? What does Israel or the Jewish nation or their religion have anything to do with Greek mythology, Greek philosophers, Greek gods? Nothing, he said. Nothing. No connection between this personal God of Israel and the God of the Greek philosophers. Even Aristotle, as brilliant as he is, says there is a self-existent being, but he isn't personal to us. He's far removed, actually. So he was a deist, but not a theist. But you open the pages of Scripture, and you came to our church 3 months ago, the very first page describes a personal God, is it not? In the Bible, God is extremely personal. He's intimately involved in all of our lives. And that's opposed to this Greek philosophy surrounding the term logos. Did you know that this word was not invented by Scripture? This was a Greek word that Greek philosophers, basically their sense of reality, every philosophy they ever had, revolves around this word logos. But it didn't mean the word to them like it does to us. It was this abstract idea that is necessary to give order and harmony to the world. You can kind of replace this with God, with existential thinking or whatever. this word helped explain the reality of things in an abstract way, but they relied on this word a lot. But what does the Bible describe logos as? This abstract idea that created reality? No, it refers to a person. This man named Jesus was logos. It can't both be right. Either he's a man and he's truth incarnate, or he's some abstract idea, or this word is just some abstract idea that helps us cope with the fact that we can't explain life itself. Now, some Christians argue that all apologetics does, it gets us to a first cause. Most Christians argue that I should stop right here, because I can't prove that the self-existent something needs to be the God of the Bible. But I disagree, obviously. Okay. We can get to a first cause, we can get to Aristotle's God, but that's as far as we can go. Now, people say this because of this concept of the incomprehensibility of God. Okay. Now, this doesn't mean that we can't know anything, but we can't know everything. We all here should believe in the incomprehensibility of God. But again, some people take that to mean, well, you can't know anything about God. Remember last week we talked about wholly other? That he's so different from us that even analogical use of language, it can't. No, we can't understand God at all. He's too big. But Christians believe, no, yes, he is incomprehensible on a lot of things, but there's some things that we can know about him. Can we know anything about God without having to have a comprehensive knowledge of God? Of course we can. That's anything in our lives. Even if our knowledge of God is partial, it doesn't mean it's not true. It's as true as far as it goes, up to the point of our understanding. Now, the Bible does teach God is eternal, self-existent, creator of all things. And Aristotle agrees with this too, but it doesn't mean it's not true. Just because the Bible says it doesn't mean it's not true. Okay. Again, the main argument for atheism, point of creation. And at that point, there has to be some kind of transcendent, self-eternal, self-existing eternal being. All right, so this gets us much closer. So, God of the Bible. There's a few arguments for this. The first one is a teleological argument. Fancy word for design or purpose. Believe it or not, our favorite friend Immanuel Kant, who is so opposed to not being able to prove the existence of God says that we cannot prove the existence of God through rational thinking, attributes the existence of God to this argument. Now, Kant said himself, quote, I can't get past two things, the starry skies above and the moral law within. The starry skies above and the moral law within. Now, he wasn't just a philosopher, but he was a scientist as well. So he knew this presence of design in the universe, in the world of nature. It's very difficult to attribute design without the concept of a designer. And that begs the question, can you have design unintentionally? There's a famous story by an atheist named Anthony Flew. It's kind of a parable of sorts, but he said, there's explorers in a jungle, and they came from a far-off land. They're exploring this place, and they came upon this garden that was beautifully manicured. Rows and rows of beautifully manicured flowers and shrubs and bushes. Obviously, there was some hand in that. But the thing is, they couldn't find the gardener. They didn't know where he was, and they waited and waited and waited, and they started postulating. Well, maybe he's invisible. Maybe he's immaterial. Maybe he came and went a long time ago. Maybe he comes when we're sleeping. They had all these ideas, and eventually, they just left, and they said, "Well, okay, I don't know. Maybe there was no garden because we can't see him. He's never coming by." Now, what's the obvious answer why we can't leave it there? Why can't we just walk away from that garden and say, well, okay, there must not be any Anyone here?
Just because you can't see it doesn't mean
What about the garden? There's a garden there that was obviously designed by someone. Now, just because you can't explain how or who or where or when, you can't not consider the garden. It was designed by someone. And yet that's the world we live in. You look at this world and people walk away going, Miss Chance, I don't know. It's cool, but you don't think about the design that we live in. And he said, God died a death of 1,000 qualifications, is what the point of that story was. Well, maybe there wasn't a gardener because of this. Well, maybe he doesn't exist because of this. Well, maybe because I can't see him in the news. Maybe he's material, he's invisible. Maybe he's elusive, he's unknowable, he's explainable. Maybe there is no God. He died a death of 1,000 qualifications. But you can't miss the obvious garden. So this is the same idea that the Enlightenment philosophers had to account for, and they couldn't escape deism. They couldn't escape deism. These weren't atheist philosophers. These were deist philosophers who believed in something solely because they couldn't avoid the implications of design. They themselves said the world operates like a perfectly built clock, and you cannot have a clock without a clockmaker. A few examples. The human eye. I don't know if you guys know off the top of now. But supposedly the human eye is more intricate than almost anything you can encounter on the face of this planet. And to assume that our eyeball does not have a designer is absurd. Or, I mean, you guys heard the odds that the Earth being as close as it is and the fact that it's tilted a little bit so that we have seasons. The odds of that happening, again, I'm saying odds, not chance, or the chance of that happening, I guess you could say, is the same chance that if you fly over the state of Texas, and the state of Texas has 3 feet of hay throughout its entire area, and you fly by and you drop a pin in that, and you walk around blindly, you pick up one piece of straw or hay. The chance of you getting that pin is the chance of something like our universe exploding into existence. Another way to say it is, if you walked by a junkyard full of rotting, thrown away parts, and a hurricane ran through it, and after the hurricane went through, you have a working plane. That's the notion of chaos or disorganization creating the universe as well. That's how intricate the design not only of our solar system is, but of our human bodies. How many of you guys have thought about when you look at a tree that 100 years ago, it was a seed? One seed. In that seed contained all the elements necessary to sprout into a 400-foot sequoia tree. Design, intention, purpose. You can't avoid it. If any of you have been pregnant and birthed a child, amazing. The process of life, creating and building and growth. Now, Aristotle did say the most important aspect of personality is intention. Intention. For something to act with intention requires a mind and requires the ability to choose what the mind plans. Personality requires intention. Intention requires mind and will. Impersonal forces have no mind, have no will, and can't design anything. You can't have purpose accidentally. You can't have impersonality that produces personality. There can't be intention unintentionally. These are all irrational statements. If there is design, then this self-eternal existence, something that is responsible for generating this design, needs to be an intelligent being. Has to have a mind, has to have a will, the ability to choose. I want the earth to be this way, not this way. I want the human being to be able to gestate over this long a period of time. And if we can prove that through this concept of design, that this self-eternal existent something has to be a personal being, Now we're talking about God. See that? So I went from nothing to something to a personal being. Now we're straight in the pages of Scripture. Now there's a second argument for this eternal being. And this is Kant's moral argument. The moral law within is something I cannot deny, says Kant. The Bible talks about this. Let me read it for you. Romans 1:28 through 32. And since, and this is after he just berated human nature and humankind to say, you guys are sinners. He says, and since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done. They were filled with all manner of unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, malice. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. Though they know God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them. Not only do they partake in them, they're giving approval, they're encouraging others to do this sort of evil. Now it's scary that this list that Paul gives is not an exhaustive list of sin. There's plenty more where this came from. I argued this last week, that every one of us knows the difference between right and wrong, internally. We know how we ought to behave sexually. We know not to rob from each other. We know not to murder someone, that being malicious against someone is evil or unloving. We know these are evil and wrong, yet, despite knowing these things, because we don't want God in our thinking, not only we do them, but we approve. We encourage others to make ourselves feel better. Misery loves company. If I steal, make me feel a lot better if you went and stole too. Can you steal that for me? Okay, good. Oh, now we're in the same boat. Romans 2:12 through 16 says this: For all who have sinned without the law will also perish without the law, and all who have sinned under the law will be judged by the law. For it is not the hearers of the law who are righteous before God, but the doers of the law who will be justified. For when Gentiles who do not have the law, by nature do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or even excuse them. On that day, when according to my gospel, God judges the secrets of men by Christ Jesus. So Paul argues that not only does God give the law to Jewish people through the Ten Commandments, thou shalt nots, he gives the law internally to every human being. And the proof of that is called the conscience. We all have a conscience. Now, consciences can be corrupted. They can be calloused. They can be hardened. They can be seared. If you don't have a conscience, what do we call that? A psychopath. Someone who can kill 50 people with no remorse whatsoever. That's not how God created us. He created us to feel terrible if we killed someone. Not because the police are going to get us, but because it's a moral law that's written on our hearts that we know what we just did is not right. I don't care if I get caught or not. So a seared conscience, it's someone who knew pure evil. It's a perversion of humanity. It's not natural to humanity. So God makes himself known through creation and through planting his moral law in the minds of every human being. Now, the counter argument of that is that our conscience is shaped by culture. Wherever we live, that's what's right and that's what's wrong. But no matter what, the conscience won't go away. Right? In different cultures, there's levels of taboos and such, but there's no culture where you won't find at least some form of ethics. Is there not? No culture in their right mind would ever start a civilization with no moral code whatsoever. there has to be a sense of oughtness in each one of us that says this is how we ought to live as a civilization. If you break that oughtness, there are consequences. This is necessary for a civilization to flourish. It really is. So no matter how much of a moral revolution that we've gone through, it's almost barbaric, actually, if you think about it. This moralistic, relativistic society that we live in. You can't escape the conscience. You just can't. Again, you can sear it. You can encourage others to help you feel better about it, but you can't escape it altogether. And if you get to a place where it's totally hardened, then guess what? You're a psychopath. Now, this is where Kant comes in and says it's a universal phenomenon that every single person has this sense of oughtness, this internal native sense of right and wrong, the sense of duty that obligates us to behave in a certain way. We can try to erase it, deny it, suppress it, but we can't escape from it altogether. Like in Romans, people even encourage others to do evil. We talked about that, to make themselves feel better, feel less guilty, but they still know in their hearts that it's wrong. Now, the problem that people have through all humanity is this problem of guilt. What do you do with your guilt? What does mankind do with his or her guilt? No one should say they don't have any. Everyone struggles with some form of guilt. They have a conscience. If it's not completely seared like a psychopath, everyone has guilt. So Kant says that this guilt comes from a failing to do our duty, what we're morally obligated to do, regardless of what culture tells us. Because if there's no moral objective truth, there's no basis for civilization, he argues. It's just a battle for preference, right? But it's not based on this universal sense of oughtness. And if we follow that logic, then you could have caste systems like in India. You can have slavery like throughout the world. You can justify all kinds of heinous crimes under that logic, that there is no universal sense of oughtness, and it's what we define it to be. Now, how many have heard of Nietzsche? Good old Nietzsche. I can never spell this.
H-E.
Yes, yeah. Okay. Probably the foremost atheist, the foremost hater of God. Interesting note, by the way. Did you know he died in an insane asylum, signing his name, Messiah? He died an insane man. That's what his conclusion led him to, a life of insanity. But in any case, he argues we should just get rid of it. Why do we need to sit here and live with our guilt? And we'll go into more of what Nietzsche says a little bit later. But Kant argued this way: if guilt is meaningful, if morality is meaningful in any way, shape, or form to civilization, if we can attribute anything of significance to it, then what would be necessary? Okay? If we can all agree in this room that, you know what, fine, this sense of morality is important. We do need it as a civilization. Then what has to be if there's going to be morality? Can I erase?
Yeah.
The first thing that there has to be is justice. A sense of justice. If crime pays, then there's no practical reason to be good or virtuous or unselfish. There has to be a system where good behavior is rewarded and bad behavior is punished. Some system of justice. Now, if there's justice, what else needs to be necessary? Remember, these are all dependent on each other. He argues that there needs to be life after death. Because we know that this world is not completely just. There's unjust things happening all the time in our courts of law. Innocent people suffering injustice, guilty people walking away free. Now, because of this imperfect justice, we have to have life after death to make sure that perfect justice is satisfied. Do you guys follow that? Yes.
What is the topic of this?
Necessary elements for morality
That's on each thing?
to exist.
that from coming from Nietzsche or Nietzsche?
From Kant. Immanuel Kant argued this. So because justice is imperfect in this world, there needs to be another world that makes things right, basically. Now, if you have life after death, then there needs to be a judge. A judge who is not only a judge, but who is morally perfect. You can have a justice system, you can have courts of law in place, but if you don't have a judge that's going to execute morally perfect decisions, then maybe the judge is corrupt. Maybe he's bribable. There won't be true justice unless there's a judge who's morally perfect in this afterlife. But just because you have a judge who's morally perfect doesn't mean he's going to execute that judgment according to how he wants it. This judge has to be omniscient. Because, let's say we satisfied all three of these elements. Justice, life after death, executes this justice. Now we have a judge who's morally perfect and does no wrong. But what if he doesn't have all the facts? What if there's a judge in a case that is so upright and you trust his or her judgment, but not all the evidence is there because maybe the lawyers are keeping some stuff, right? That would hurt their case. So this judge, if he wants to execute this perfect justice, has to be able to know everything about every situation, about everyone at every time, if you want this perfect justice to be upheld. So he needs to be omniscient, no error, no incomplete data. Is that enough? One more element. He can have all these things. What if he's powerless to actually execute this judgment? What if there's stronger forces in the universe that goes against this judge? And therefore, the judge needs to be omnipotent. All five of these things need to exist if you're going to attribute any importance to morality. If this judge is restricted by some kind of outside force, then there's no guarantee that this justice will ever take place. If he's too weak, if he's incompetent. So if your sense of oughtness, if your sense of morality is going to matter, that means you have to matter. And that means you have to survive past this life because many injustices have been done to you and by you, and that you'll be held accountable for everything that you've ever done. So he would argue, if morality is true, if we hold on to this, then the existence of God is a practical reality. We must live as if there is a God. We must live as if there is a God. Because if there isn't, there is literally no hope for human civilization. He would argue we need to believe for practical purposes. Critics still says it doesn't matter. Nietzsche still says it doesn't matter. Because he says life is meaningless. Life is meaningless and hopeless, but most people don't live this way. Right? They may not want God. You may have atheists out there that to their dying day they won't admit that there's a God, but they still want morality. They still want some form of ethics. They still want meaning, some kind of purpose to their lives. Otherwise you end up in an insane asylum, like Nietzsche. And Kant says you can't have both. You can't say that God doesn't exist and refute that to your dying day and still say, oh, but I still want ethics. I still want morality. What is that morality based on, if not this universal sense of oddness? Okay. Now, let me talk about
So
the
you
critic.
create the thing,
Yeah.
concept of meaningless? Because I mean, it says it in Ecclesiastes as well.
I'm about to get to that. Yes.
Oh.
Yes. Okay. Now, critics would look at this and say, it still doesn't prove the existence of God. Just because you say he's necessary for morality to exist, doesn't necessarily mean that there's a God. Right? You can wish for a judge with all-powerful and righteous and omnipotent and all-knowing, but it still doesn't mean it's true. Can I erase this?
Oh wait, I have a
Yes.
question. So, so you know how people have a sense of guilt?
Mhm.
Is it ingrained in us, whether or not we believe in God?
Correct.
Okay.
That's not only what the Bible teaches us, but human life itself. Everyone has
Okay.
guilt, whether you're a Christian.
Is it because were we just born with that, or was it because like we were taught like, oh, this
They
is
show
wrong?
that the work of the law is written on their hearts,
Okay.
while their consciences also bear witness in our hearts. We ourselves, whether someone tells us something that's right or wrong, we have an internal sense of oughtness within us. And you might not know it when you commit something, but when it's committed against you, you know something's wrong. If I don't have to teach you as a 2-year-old that stealing someone's toys is wrong, because the moment I steal your toy, so an injustice has been done to me. How dare you take my stuff? It's ingrained in us. Right? If I took your wallet and you have no sense, it's gonna bother you. If I slept with your wife, oh my gosh, there's something not right about these things. And Kant's argument is it comes from a self-eternal existent being. All right, so there are critics that say, no, this doesn't prove anything, but let's talk about that. So really, in everything that I've talked about so far, it falls in between one of these two poles. On this side is pure theism. Okay? On this side is what we call nihilism. Nihilism. No meaning, no sense, no hope, nothing. And that's what Nietzsche believed. But there are very few philosophies that fall on either one of these extremes. Somewhere in the middle. Somewhere in the middle. Now, speaking of Ecclesiastes, right, in the wisdom literature in the Bible, these are the two views in play here. Where Solomon himself says, life under the sun, life under heaven. Two kinds of lives. One under God and one not under God. Life under the sun is not God. Life under heaven is God. And what is his conclusion? If there is no God, what's the V word he uses?
Vanity.
Life is vanity of vanity. Now that's a weird phrase. Vanity of vanity. When I say the word vanity, we're not talking about vain. Oh, I think I'm so handsome or pretty. We're talking about meaninglessness. Something that is futile. When the Bible repeats words like King of Kings, Lord of Lords, what is the Bible doing? What is the Hebrew language doing? Emphasizing. It's exaggerating. It's an extreme position taken by the writer. So when Solomon says life is vanity of vanity, he means it. It's meaningless. We're talking about a guy who was wiser than anyone who ever lived. We're talking about a guy who was richer than anyone who ever lived. He had 100 wives. He had 1,000 concubines. And he wasn't bored sitting on his throne. He worked. He created. He created beautiful landscapes and gardens. So he was very project-oriented. He kept himself busy. He literally did everything. And it wasn't just some futile, materialistic type of living. Like I said, he was full of wisdom. So he knew how to allocate his resources. He knew how to lead an army. He knew how to build temples. But he lived his life and he said it was meaningless. It meant nothing. Now, again, most philosophers won't go to either extreme. But what I will argue is this. That if you fall in this extreme, forget I just read that. Wherever you are in between these two poles, you're going to borrow capital from one side or the other. Let me explain what that means. At the end of the day, if you're a humanist, like a materialist, if all you believe that this is it, I would say that you're extremely naive. Because if there is no God, we come from nothing. We're accidentally created. It was a meaningless event. We came from slime, and we'll go to slime, and our lives are moving toward annihilation. That's what a humanist believes. That's what Nietzsche believed. From meaninglessness to meaninglessness. But in between those two poles, in your 80-year life, you're searching for meaning. You want a life that has meaning. Don't kid yourself. But they can't admit that it's purely based on emotions, that they don't have the courage to allow full-blown atheism. Very few people have that kind of courage to say, you know what? I'm going to live this life as if there's no meaning. Because what that means in its final conclusion is that your life has zero purpose, zero meaning. Your ethics are, where do they come from? Your existence doesn't matter at all. And no human being wants to hear that. No one even lives that way for more than 5 minutes. There's no reason to fight for human rights. There's no reason to value human relationships, the family unit, your work, friendships, romance, food. What's the point? There's no basis for human dignity if you don't believe in God. That's what these guys believe. No human dignity whatsoever. It's no wonder that Hitler read one of Nietzsche's books before he decided his blitzkrieg. No matter how you live your life, no matter how much you want to believe this, you're always having to borrow attributes of theism. You have to. And that's what I mean when it says borrowing capital. You can't live this way for more than 5 minutes until you borrow some capital from here. You have to believe that there's some sort of human dignity, that life is worth living in some way, shape, or form. Everyone compromises. And this is what Kant said regarding his moral argument, that even atheists can't escape this internal moral guilt that they feel. Now, if there is no one home here, okay, if there is no God, then the Bible is right. 1 Corinthians, if Christ is not raised, then we are of all people to be most pitied. So if you see people getting mad at you because you're a Christian, and say they don't believe in God, and their biggest gripe with you is that you believe in some kind of God, say, look, don't be mad at us. You need to pity us. Because if you believe that there's no God, and that Jesus is still a dead man in the grave, I'm wasting my time. What am I doing? Right? I might as well live the way that you're living. Maybe somewhere in between. Maybe it's hedonism. Maybe it's some other form of pleasure seeking. But I'm wasting my time if Jesus Christ is dead man. So feel sorry for me. Don't be mad at me. Now, Kant didn't want to go away from hope. He did not want to be a nihilist. Because he knows no one wants hopelessness. Every cell in our body points to some form of hope. We wake up in the morning because there's some form of hope in us. Our lives count. Now, this is where some philosophy has gone, though. Okay? And there's a philosopher named Albert Camus. How many of you have heard of this guy? I haven't. Oh, you have? Oh, you have? Oh, nice. Camus, French philosopher. Very recent, 1950s. But he took a very sober approach to this nihilistic mindset. He said this: the only question to ask, if you truly believe that there is no God, is suicide. He went that far. You might like it temporarily. You might like it if, say, for instance, you go to a school and there's no teachers. There's no moral authority. We're free. You can do whatever you want. But when that wears off, when you're done with all your pleasure seeking, and you really start to think about your life as meaningless, that you're not held accountable for anything, and you don't count for anything, and your existence is nothing but a cosmic accident, then he agrees. There's really no alternative than just kill yourself. Another philosopher, Jean-Paul Sartre. He defined man as a useless passion. We are useless passions. He noticed that humans are not robots. We have emotions. We're living, breathing, thinking, choosing beings, caring beings. Human life is marked by care and passion. But if everything you care about is worthless and meaningless, they're all useless passions. Your family members, your loved ones, your children, your job, useless passions. What are you wasting your time for? Going back to Nietzsche, the premier nihilist. He takes it a step further. He says, if we can't know God exists, it's not enough to build our faith by crossing our fingers and hoping. Okay? If we can't know God exists, don't do this leap of faith nonsense. If the evidence points to a universe of chance, then we need to have the boldness to say, okay, this universe is meaningless, and I need to face that reality that I came from slime, and I'm going to slime, but I will not run to religion. That's what Nietzsche said. I will not. I'm going to be honest about it. Yeah, it sucks that life is meaningless. I wish it wasn't, but I can't prove the existence of God, so therefore I must believe it. But I am not going to run to religion as my crutch, as my escape. Now, escapism is all throughout our culture to get away from this belief system. People try to drown it through drugs and alcohol and therapy and whatever else. Nietzsche and other skeptics say that these aren't the only drugs. The biggest actual drug, the primary one, is religion. And he hated it for it. He says the only reason you're a Christian is because you need a crutch to help you function when you're really actually crippled. It's a psychological crutch because we can't bear the reality that this is a possibility. We can't bear that fact, so we run to church, we run to God, we run to Buddha, we run to the sun, we run to anything to help define our existence. But he says, not me. Not me. The great thinkers of nihilism, Nietzsche, Freud, Marx. You guys know about Marx, the inventor of communism. Right? He basically instituted the government level atheism that we see in China, that we see in Russia. And he said this: religion is opium for the masses. You guys heard of that phrase? Opium for the masses. Religion is just one brand of hedonism that helps people escape this meaninglessness, futility of life. Now, these three guys, though, they presupposed that God didn't exist. So when they say things like, since there is no God, why are humans incurably religious? Not if there is no God, why, but since there is no God. So you can see there's already a bias. And that's how I'll end this session, about the bias. We'll get to that in a second. Why is it that everywhere we go, in every culture of humankind, from the beginning of man to today, the vast majority of people are engaged in some form of religion? And they argue psychological fear. Of course. The main reason people believe in God is because of the consequences that they're afraid of if there is no God. Without God, we're doomed, we're hopeless, everything's meaningless, and we can't bear that fact. And so you know what? I'm just going to believe in God because of that fact. But what if the crutch is actually for the atheist and not for the Christian? You know, it's obvious that brilliant people have different thoughts when it comes to God, and they agree and disagree on all aspects of theology. So, can we argue that it's a difference in intellect? Right? You have Thomas Aquinas, you have St. Augustine, you have Jonathan Edwards, some of the brightest minds to ever exist. And you have Stephen Hawking, Richard Dawkins, all these brilliant scientists, atheists. Could it really be a difference in intellect? No. So we need to admit that the question about the existence of God, it's loaded with psychological baggage. It's loaded. When you go to a basketball game and you see how the fans, especially like, let's say it's a little league basketball or baseball game, and you see dads especially going nuts on the coach or referee when they're seeing things that really ought not to be called, but because they're so emotionally invested in the game, they have such a bias towards their son's team or their daughter's team that they see everything through that lens. We've been there before. Maybe it's not a sports event, but it's something else. And this just shows we're capable of seeing things through the lens of our own bias. We can freely admit that. And I'll be honest, I want to believe in God. I want to believe in God. I don't want life to be meaningless. I don't want nihilism. So I agree that it's possible for people to construct their own beliefs, their own religions, philosophical systems on the basis of their own desires. Okay? I agree with that wholeheartedly. But At the end of the day, the reality of God's existence cannot be determined based on what I want to be true. And we talked about that in the last example last week, where the woman was arguing, well, to you, you can worship and go to church and be passionate about prayer and read the Bible. That's great, then God exists for you. But for me, he does not. And what was the response to that? We're not talking about the same thing here. We're talking about a God who exists whether you believe in him or not. A God that exists whether I believe in him or not. No matter how much I sing and pray to him, I'm not going to bring this God into existence. Nor is your denial of him going to take him out of existence. He either exists or he doesn't. It doesn't matter what you and I believe about it. Now, just because it shows my desires for there to want to be a God doesn't mean it's true, right? It doesn't prove God either way. But there's two sides to that coin. Everyone is selling. Everyone else, besides me and whoever in this room, agrees with my sentiment. Other people are also held to the same standard. They're subject to this honesty and psychology that if you deny the existence of God, there's enormous interest in the fact that you deny God. There's self-interest that Edmund talked about this today. God is the greatest obstacle to my own autonomy. The scariest thing for any man or woman to face is you and your sinfulness standing before God in his holiness. It's utterly frightening if you think about it. That if you didn't have Jesus to cover you, and you're standing before holy God, and he's standing in your presence when he's perfect and you're not, it's frightening. It should be frightening. If I've ever sinned and have not repented of that sin, that literally is the worst thing that can happen to me, is to fall in the hands of an angry God. And therefore, as an atheist, I will reject it and I will deny it because I don't want to be held accountable to some God. I don't want to go there. Now, they might not admit that overtly. That's part of the psychology of atheism. So again, there's a psychology for God. We know that. There's a psychology for atheism as well. So we have to be objective. We have to prove his existence based on objectivity, which I've hopefully showed you through these 2 weeks. But I'm saying this in response to the Nietzsche's and the Marxists of the world who say we only believe because of our fear. Our psychological fear that if we don't believe, then I can't get to the fact that life is meaningless, and I don't want that because I love my kids, I love my wife, and I want there to be meaning in my workplace and things like that. But there's as much psychological pressure to deny God as much as there is to believe him. It goes both ways. The knife cuts both ways. Because why else would someone as brilliant as Stephen Hawking believe in something as absurd as spontaneous generation? Or a Nobel Prize winning physicist at Stanford to say, no, gradual spontaneous generation. Why else? It's not their intellect. Romans 1 tells us that natural man has no room for the existence of God. None. Because if we allow or admit even a sliver of God's existence into our hearts, we know exactly what that means for our lives. We have to live a certain way. We're going to be held accountable by a certain God at the end of the day. Now, Paul says not only can we know God, but Paul says we do know God's existence. Chapter 1 and 2. At the end of the day, our problem with God is not intellectual. It's moral. It's not that we can't know God. It's that we don't want God. Verse 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. This word suppress in the Greek means held down, stifled. Think of an image of a coil, like a spring, where it's meant to pop up. The only way that it's not going to pop up is that you just hold it down. But there's resistance. There's resistance. It's meant to come up, but you're choosing to push it down. That's what that Greek word implies. And God's anger literally boils over when people do this, when they suppress the truth of his existence. They know it in their heart, but they're like, no, God, I don't want you. It also says in verse 19 and 20 that God has given humans knowledge that is clear. The Greek word is plain to them. It's not some obscure mysticism that we have to search far and wide to find out about who God is. He makes it clear. divine nature and eternal existence. But what we do with it is we hold it down and we resist it. We bury it. We bury this truth. Now, in modern psychology, there's plenty of people who bury things in their minds, right? But what kind of knowledge, what kind of information or memories do we tend to suppress? Trauma, abuse, neglect, something crazy happened in your life. Okay. Now, if you're sitting in a psychologist's office, they know that you can't forget it completely. You'll never forget what happened that day. But there's other ways to cope with it, right? Maybe it'll come out in less threatening ways. Maybe it comes out through dreams. Maybe there's nonverbal ways that it just kind of comes out. You deal with it differently. Okay. This word metalosa, where we read in the Bible, where we as human beings, we exchange the truth of God for created things. So not only do we suppress it, we substitute it with other things. That's exactly what happens in a psychologist's office. You suppress that bad thought and they tell you, replace it with other things, right? Fill your minds with happy thoughts. Why don't you take this drug to help cope with the pain? Why don't you do this and why don't you do that? This is the primary sin of man, is idolatry, right? Where people in the world, they serve an inanimate idol. They can't bear the fact that there's this God who's going to hold them accountable to their morals. And so they create this other God, or they buy him at the store, and they worship him every day. How threatening is that God? No. Doesn't speak, doesn't hear, doesn't move. Actually, in fact, you're the one that purchased him. You're the one that made him with your own hands. You go to Thailand, you see it every other block. People are worshiping these statues. But why are they doing that? They're suppressing the truth of God, and they're replacing him with something that's less threatening. Not as traumatic as a holy God who's going to hold me accountable if it's not for Jesus Christ. They don't want to deal with that. So they exchange it for a lie. Other all non-threatening ways to deal with it. Not wanting to believe in nihilism. They want to be a theist, but not in the holy God of Israel. The greatest fear is to be held accountable. In the presence of a holy, we're immediately exposed as unholy. And think about this for a second. What other religion besides pure theism, right? Christianity, Islam, and Judaism believes in a God that is omnipotent, omniscient, and immutable. He doesn't change. He's never going to forget what you did back in high school. He's never going to get Alzheimer's. There's not a single thing in your life that he's going to miss. And you're going to stand before him and held to be accountable to that? Not me. Aside from the work of God, I don't want that. Nor does all humanity. And the Bible says that very clearly 2,000 years ago. It knows man's heart. God knows our hearts. And because of this, it's our basic disposition to flee from God. I would say psychology of atheism, as strong or stronger than the psychology of theism. Both sides have very compelling reasons to believe what they believe. I don't believe in God. I do believe in God, and here's why. It's never an intellectual battle. Again, it's so crazy that Edmund spoke about this today, but Adam and Eve, what was their first response once sin entered into their hearts? Flee. To hide. Why did they do that? Why not just say, God, I'm naked, I'm ashamed of it, can you please help me? They ran. They knew who God was. They knew about his holiness and his nature.